Hello, everybody. Hopefully this stream is working. This is my first streaming video from home. Hopefully my internet will remain reliable today, and I hope that the sound is good. If anybody's on there and can hear me talking, I'd love to have a comment that the sound is okay. All right. Well, nobody's telling me the sound is not okay, so I'm going to proceed as though it is. So today we're matching our regular class time that we're going to be having for our online classes upcoming. And it is the long weekend, and we didn't really get a lot of information out about this. But coming up, we are going to be having classes on Saturdays at 1:30, live streamed. Most of them will be from the Sword Hall instead of from here. If those go well, we will probably add some sort of a discussion class where we look at manuscripts and things like that. And we'll see how that goes. But the Saturday classes will be a half an hour, and initially they will be mostly repetitive drill. We'll go through the Einzelstück and some of our techniques, but it will be a slow-paced drill class. So that's going to be the schedule for those going forward, and we're going to try and figure out how to give priority to those for the people who are our online subscribers. There's a lot of new learning going on for us in doing these things. So yeah, we will be having those classes going forward. Now, the other main purpose of this video today was to set up an Ask Me Anything, and I'm happy to take questions, but because I know that a lot of people might be busy and we're not sure how many questions we're going to get, I'm also prepared to talk about the sources that we use, how we use the sources, and how we got there, and a little bit about how I interpret historical sources and my approach to teaching from the historical sources. And a lot of this is actually tied to my own personal history experience with getting into sword fighting. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on that. Some of you have heard this before, but in 1997, I moved to New Zealand. I lived there for 2 years, and I joined up with a sword fighting group that were doing what I call historical reenactment combat. So it was a competitive combat system for historical reenactors. It was definitely not a complete martial arts system. There were target restrictions, things like that, that affected the way that we could fight. But it was actual competitive fighting, and we trained pretty hard. I really liked it a lot. And at the time, one of the instructors there, hey, good afternoon. I see somebody's said hello. So at the time, my instructor there showed me George Silver's manuscript that he had a really kind of crummy printout of, and that was the first historical source I had ever seen. So George Silver is an English swordmaster who wrote a book in 1599 that was published, and a follow-up that we have the handwritten manuscript for that was never published. So George Silver's system is not the same as what we teach, and his approach to writing was very different. But that was my first exposure to the historical manuscript. So when I moved back to Canada, I wanted to keep going. I connected with a fencing instructor who is running a rapier fencing program, and he too was largely working with George Silver as a source material. And we used to tell people that we do rapier fencing as George Silver would have done it if he liked rapier fencing. And many people dispute the idea that George Silver knew anything about rapier fencing. However, a little bit like if anybody's seen Quigley Down Under, the fact that he didn't have much use for it didn't mean he didn't know how to do it. A lot of his principles could be applied to what we were doing. But George Silver's approach to fighting really stayed with me, or my understanding of George Silver's approach to fencing. And Then I got access to more historical sources. And the first big one that I started looking at was the 133, the Valpurgis manuscript, the sword and buckler German system. And I'm a big fan of sword and buckler, so I really delved deep into that. And that was where I was doing more my own research for the first time, rather than sort of following what other people taught me about things. However, in trying to understand it, I got into online discussions, was told that I needed to study all of Lichtenauer's art in order to understand 133, which I did, although I actually think that that statement is not correct. So from 133, I moved into studying Lichtenauer's art, but for a variety of reasons, I actually went through Lecouchner's Messerfechten, which I have Jeffrey Forging's translation of here that I quite like. And there were a number of reasons why I started with the Messerfechten, and I spent a lot of time working on that, and that was my introduction. Now, at the time, I was told that Lecouchner had used one of the earlier sources, the Von Danzig book, as the basis for his Messerfechten book. Lecouchner's book is much bigger and much more involved, but it is very similar. But I actually think it's more based on the line of Judd Leo's approach. So we're now looking into the German sources, and I should say my German pronunciation is horrendous, I'm sure. And I have my own pronunciations of the names, which are probably wrong. I also like to stick with the names of the manuscripts because the names used for the manuscripts rather than just number things, because they're a little bit more evocative. So now we mostly do Longsword, and our primary sources are what are often called the early Lichtenauer sources, and particularly the ones that are similar to each other, which are Ringek, Judd Leo, and Peter von Danzig. And when we have a disagreement between the three texts, we use Judd Leo as our preferred choice, although we do look at all three of them. And I think that that's really valuable. Now, one of the things that is very different about my approach is compared to most other historical fencers that I've seen who are doing Lichtenauer sources, I use a much further distance than those people advocate, and I strongly believe that that's what's indicated by the texts, but I'm not going to have that argument right now. So yeah, our main source is Judd Leo, and again, I have a book that I use. This is the translation that I follow along. This is a really well put together book. I love it. And it has references to the other sources in it, which are great. So that's really good. Now, I do want to mention that I said we would do primarily Longsword, and that I got into this from Sword and Buckler to Grossemesser to Longsword. And I do think it's really important to understand that the early sources have other material in them for other weapons, and I think that that is crucial to understanding even the Longsword system, is to look at all of the different weapon systems and the bits and pieces and seeing how they fit together. So we use the appendices that are in the Longsword sources on other weapons and armored combat. And although we don't have access to horses, we have even studied the mounted combat to understand how all of that fits together. And I really think that another approach I take when I'm looking at interpreting things is that if an interpretation only works with one of the weapons, but doesn't work with something else when it's used in the same way in another part of the sources, that can't be right. So we try and find interpretations that fit with all the places that they appear in the combined sources that we use. I did want to mention a couple of other things, which is that we also rely on some of the other manuscripts from around the same time and area. Peter Falconer's Fett book is very useful, especially for staff and polearms, and has some interesting dagger stuff that we don't see anywhere else. The Longsword and Grossemesser looks the same as everywhere else, although it's not very complete. It's not detailed a lot. but the other weapons are really a benefit there. And then Dobringer House Book, the so-called Dobringer House Book, again, I like to use those names, has a lot of interesting information, and I will say that I had a lot of trouble understanding that when I first started interpreting it, but now that I've looked at the other sources and gone back and looked at it again, it makes a lot more sense to me what's going on in there. So we do refer to that as well. Funnily enough, with everything that I've studied, everything I've done now, if I was starting a brand new sword fighting school from square one, I would actually probably entirely use Codex Wallerstein. So one of the things I like about Lichtenauer's system is that it is a stripped down system. If we look at later stuff like Joachim Meyer, or we look at even Fiore, who is same time or even possibly earlier than Lichtenauer, depending who you believe, they're a lot more involved and complicated. There's a lot more different stuff. Lichtenauer's system is quite stripped down, and I believe that that is intentionally so. And the system presented in Codex Wallerstein, to me, looks like it's an even more stripped down combat system, which makes it really straightforward, and that works really well with the way that I think about fighting. The biggest things that I want to avoid in a sword fight is having to think about what I'm trying to do before I just do it, and having too many decisions to have to make. And I believe Lichtenauer's system and the system presented in Codex Wallerstein do a good job of making your choices simple and obvious. So yeah, that's kind of my history of the sources and a little bit about how I approach them. And that's all I've got to say about that. So I've been talking for about 10 minutes, it looks like here, by the clock. And I see a couple of people have said hello, but I haven't had any questions. Does anybody have any questions that they want to throw out here? I'm curious if YouTube Live has the feature where it shows the little somebody is typing thing. I don't see anything like that right now. So yeah, that's really it for me. I am just going to say again, next week we will have a class at 1:30. We'll give out more information, but it will be a drill class like we did last week. So people will want to have some kind of, yeah, I see a test comment, but I didn't see any typing before that. I just saw the word test come up. So I guess the little ... thing doesn't happen. So the class next week will, you will need something to yep, you're live too. Oh, I see. Or is that your name on there? I have Joe Hall. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so it's a little bit tricky to read. Joe Hell. I knew who it was anyway. But yes, yeah, I saw that I saw Joel that you liked the link on Facebook, so I figured it must be you when I saw the name. So yeah, next week you'll want to have something to use as a sword simulator for when we're doing the drill class. I will this time post more information about the class. And I have a question from Jacques, so I'm going to answer that. And it is, how important are the images to you? That's a really complicated question. So this video is suddenly going to get a lot longer because I like to talk a lot about the videos. So, or about the images. The images in the, I'm assuming Jacques is asking about the images in the historical manuscripts. The reason why it's complicated is because I think that the images are valuable and important, but I don't think that they tell us what we normally would assume that they tell us. They aren't presented in the way that modern people think about pictures. They certainly are not photographic representations, and they vary from manuscript to manuscript as to what kind of information they are trying to convey. So I unfortunately don't have my copy of 133 right beside me, or I would show you one of the things that I talk about with this. In 133, there's a lot of images that show people holding the buckler, and to the viewer it's edge on with a big point pointed at the other person, and the buckler is oversized. And it looks like they're holding the buckler edge on, but I actually have a very specific good reason to believe that that is actually demonstrating holding the buckler sort of overpronated this way. And there's old videos explaining why I think that. But that is a really important indicator in the image, but it isn't really obvious what it means. And a lot of the illustrations in that particular manuscript are, I'm going to say, bad. They are poorly drawn. Some of them are just stylistically different from what we understand, but some of them are actually bad, as well as the fact that some of them have been vandalized. So those pictures are valuable, but it's really hard to know what parts of them are accurate, what parts of them are accurate from the perspective of a medieval person, and what parts of them are just weren't important to the illustrator or were poorly drawn. So I have a lot of thoughts on how those pictures mean things. And to give a really simple idea of what I'm talking about, try and find a picture anywhere of a medieval picture of people playing chess. And you'll see that the chessboard is shown as a square, which is side on to the viewers. And then all the chess pieces are shown as like little, almost icons of chess pieces sitting on the chessboard. And if this was a literal image, like a photo, that would mean that the chessboard was sitting up on its edge and all those pieces were sitting on little shelves on the chessboard. But I don't think that's what it means. What it means is that being able to see the whole chessboard was important to the person who drew that picture. And we can put that in our minds into a context that makes sense, but it's not a literal representation. We see things in medieval art too, where like in some images, important people are bigger than unimportant people. And while, you know, wealthy people had better diets and possibly grew better, the scale is improbable at the very least. We see other things where there's something that they were trying to convey that was important to them, and probably viewers who saw those pictures at the time understood those things, but quite often we don't. So on a completely separate note about pictures, the other thing about them is that sometimes the illustrators were not the same people who were writing the books, or something like that, and errors crept in. So sometimes the text actually directly contradicts what appears to be in the picture. And in those cases, I think that the text has to overrule the pictures. So pictures are important and valuable. Our main sources don't actually have pictures. It's really hard to understand sometimes what they're saying, but it can be done with a lot of work and patience. So yeah. So for next class, we are going to, I have the question on here, we are going to be working on Longsword again. We will work some single sword stuff into the class, but remember, anything you can do with a longsword, you can do with a single sword. So if anybody wants to use a single sword for the class, you can. I'm just not going to be doing anything that is kind of unique to single sword, and I will be using a longsword to demonstrate the techniques. So that's kind of a little bit of your choice. And of course, you can use anything as a simulator that you've got available. I'm not gonna be super picky about that. All right, well, I'm gonna say, is there any more questions? And then I'll ramble for a couple of minutes so that people can type in questions if there's any burning need for more information. Thank you to everybody who has shown up today on the long weekend during quarantine. Woo! Oh, and here, oh, Patrick has a question regarding Sprechfenster. Oh yes, this could be contentious if anybody not from Ottawa Swordplay sees my answer. I have a very specific and unique interpretation of Sprechfenster. But I will be happy to answer your question. How does it relate to timing? Oh, and the decision point. Okay, so one of the things that you should know is that the decision point is it is something that I learned from one of my previous fencing instructors. And I don't know if they thought of it as a piece of terminology, but I took it as a piece of terminology and used it. And later into my interpretation of the system, I basically realized that Sprechfenster acts as kind of the decision point in a lot of ways. So the idea of Sprechfenster, it's described in the manuscripts as, now it is described primarily as standing with your left foot forward and with your arms and weapon extended, and that it is just long point. Later on, they talk about techniques with Sprechfenster where your right foot is forward. So basically, I see it as Sprechfenster works as what I have always called the decision point, or that is one of the ways that you can use Sprechfenster, that from your tower guard or whatever starting guard you're going into, you move your sword forward and you are getting ready to step, but you have not stepped, so your left foot is forward. And from that point, you can make the decision to make a transition into a different technique. Now, the other thing, though, is that you can actually move your sword to Sprechfenster and just stand in Sprechfenster if you want to. It's sort of a halfway starting point. I just think that if you're moving to Sprechfenster, you should be ready for the fact that you might have to move right away. So let's see. Can Sprechfenster with the blade down as well as up if required? Possibly. I wouldn't generally use it that way. If I have the blade low, then typically I think of when I move the point up into getting ready to, as the first part of my next technique, that is moving again into or through Sprechfenster to get to the next technique. So if your point is down and then you bring your sword up and do a technique, at some point, I generally would transition through what I call Sprechfenster. I'm going to tie this to some weird stuff because, so 133, the Sword and Buckler manuscript, Valpurga's Feck book, talks about long point, and Sprechfenster is just long point. Now, 133 doesn't talk about Sprechfenster specifically, but it shows a bunch of different versions of long point, some of which look like the sword is pointed low. So it is possible that there are versions of long point where the sword is low. I honestly am not convinced that those pictures in 133 are actually trying to show the point being low. I suspect that it is some kind of foreshortening that isn't working for us as a modern audience. So yeah, to me, the purpose of Sprechfenster is that your sword is halfway into the technique, which means that it is more forward and ready than in most of your waiting guard positions. So I personally wouldn't want to try and do a version of Sprechfenster with the point low, but I'm willing to be convinced otherwise by a good solid argument. So that's my take on Sprechfenster. Now, I would say you can do Sprechfenster with your sword on the right and with your right foot forward, going from left to right, and it ends up looking a little bit odd. But then it looks like some of the illustrations in, I think it's Peter Faulkner that has the weirdest illustration of Sprechfenster. All right. So again, next week, 1:30, and I will be at the Sword Hall again, and we'll have somebody there on standby to take questions in a similar format. We'll go through the Einzelstück, which somebody commented on a previous video about the Einzelstück that we should have called it the Parat, which is actually not a bad name. So we're going to have to think about whether we want to change the name of Einzelstück to Parat or something else. Maybe there's an even better name out there. Anyway, we'll do that, and we'll also go through some slow techniques and stuff like that. I'll be focusing on longsword. you can adapt to other weapons. And in future weeks, we will mix up the weapons at least a little bit. So thank you all for coming today. I hope that this was worthwhile, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.